Look, the supply clerk thinks she can teach us something about long-range shooting. Ma'am, the only thing you're qualified to zero is a spreadsheet, the words, dripping with the casual cruelty of unearned authority, echoed across the firing line. The crowd of hardened rangers, clad in dusty multicam and smelling of sweat and gunpowder, laughed. It was a brittle, sycophantic sound, meant to reinforce the fragile hierarchy of the field. The man who spoke, Staff Sergeant Rex Thorne, grinned, a predator pleased with his kill. He was the gatekeeper of this domain, a place of wind, steel, and skill, and he had just publicly marked his territory. But the target of his scorn, Sergeant Ava Morgan, didn't flinch. She offered no verbal retort, no defensive posture, no flicker of anger in her steady gaze. She simply made a final notation on her digital tablet, her movements as calm and economical as a surgeon's. Her silence was a void into which Thorne's arrogance disappeared without an echo. A few hundred yards away, in a climate-controlled observation tower, Colonel Davies watched the exchange on a high-definition monitor. He saw the overt mockery and the quiet, almost unnerving, lack of reaction. But when the general saw her stance, a subtle, perfectly balanced alignment of bone and muscle, even while standing still, a ghost of a memory stirred. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, a forgotten file opening in the archives of his mind. If you believe that true competence needs no introduction, type professional below. The air on Range 17 was a physical entity, a thick, shimmering blanket of heat that distorted the distant targets into watery mirages. It tasted of grit and smelled of sun-baked creosote. This was the crucible for the 75th Ranger Regiment's advanced marksmanship program, a place where legends were forged and egos were shattered. Staff Sergeant Thorne considered himself the chief blacksmith. He moved with a swagger that broadcast his own self-assessed importance, his voice a perpetual bark that tolerated no dissent. To him, the world was simple. There were Rangers, and there was everyone else. The everyone else were POGs, people other than grunts, a universe of lesser beings who shuffled paper, drove trucks, and counted beans. And Sergeant Ava Morgan, standing before him with a logistics insignia on her collar, was the quintessential bean counter. She had been tasked with a field audit of ammunition expenditure for the exercise, a bureaucratic intrusion into his sacred world of warfighting. Her presence was an affront, a symbol of the rear echelon nonsense that, in his mind, constantly sought to undermine the lethality of the tip of the spear. He decided to make an example of her. He needed to reassert the natural order. His men needed to see that this place was for warriors only. "Sergeant," he had boomed, ensuring everyone could hear, "since you're so interested in our ammunition, maybe you'd like to demonstrate how it's used? Or are you afraid the recoil might chip your nail polish?" The laughter that followed was his validation. He had established the frame. He was the expert. She was the interloper. Morgan, however, refused to occupy the box he had built for her. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention back to her task. Her composure was a quiet rebellion. It infuriated him. It was as if his words, his entire performance of dominance, hadn't even registered. She was an observer, a ghost in the machine, and her silence was more potent than any argument she could have made. The younger Rangers, eager to curry favor with their instructor, played their part, nudging each other and smirking in her direction. A few of the older NCOs, men who had seen enough of the world to know that assumptions were a dangerous currency, looked away, a flicker of discomfort in their eyes. They knew Thorne was posturing, but challenging him here, now, was a line they wouldn't cross. Morgan continued her work, her focus absolute. She wasn't just counting boxes. She was observing. She noted the wind, watching the subtle dance of heat haze and dust devils. She observed the shooters, their breathing patterns, the way they settled behind their rifles. She was a study in stillness, a calm island in a sea of performative masculinity, and her quiet competence was a language Thorne and his acolytes had long forgotten how to speak. They saw a clerk. They saw a woman out of her element. They saw what they wanted to see. They never once thought to look at her hands, steady, calloused, practiced, or the way her eyes scanned the distant, jagged ridgeline not with administrative boredom, but with a deep, instinctual, and predatory focus. The exercise began under Thorne's bellowed commands. Targets are hot. Identify and engage at will. Show me what you've got, boys. The Rangers settled behind their M110 sniper systems, the heavy crack of the 762mm rounds beginning to punctuate the oppressive silence of the desert. For a few minutes, it was a textbook training scenario. Steel plates, hidden in the folds of the desolate landscape, rang out with satisfying pings as the elite soldiers found their marks. Thorne paced behind the line, offering a mix of praise and sharp-witted insults to keep his men on edge. Morgan stood off to the side, her audit seemingly complete, watching the proceedings with that same unnerving calm. Then, the rhythm changed. A sharp, unfamiliar crack echoed from the ridgeline, followed a split second later by the vicious snap of a supersonic bullet passing dangerously close over the firing line. It wasn't the dull thud of a round hitting the dirt berm behind them. It was the sound of a near miss. Thorne froze. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" He yelled, his voice tight with confusion. Another crack snap, this one kicking up a geyser of dust a few feet from a prone ranger. This was not part of the exercise. The steel targets were passive. These rounds were active, hostile, and terrifyingly accurate. Chaos began to blossom. The Rangers, trained for direct action, were suddenly on the receiving end of a sophisticated, concealed enemy. They scrambled for better cover, their training kicking in, but they were exposed, caught in a perfectly executed ambush. "Where is it coming from?" a young specialist shouted, his voice cracking. Thorne frantically scanned the ridge with his binoculars, but saw nothing. No mousseline, no movement, just the shimmering heat and the menacing rocks. They were being hunted by ghosts. It was then that Morgan moved. She didn't run or shout. She walked with deliberate purpose to a large, unassuming Pelican case she had placed near the supply truck. While Thorne screamed orders into his radio, trying to make sense of the unfolding disaster, Morgan's hands moved with a fluid, practiced grace. She unlatched the case, revealing not a laptop or auditing equipment, but the deep, dark gleam of oiled steel. It was a rifle, but not one the Rangers recognized. It was an M210, an older, heavily modified platform, a relic from a previous generation of warfare. Its stock was worn smooth in places, telling a story of countless hours of contact with a skilled shoulder. The scope was a modern, high-powered optic, but it was mounted with a level of precision that spoke of personal, obsessive care. She produced a magazine from a simple pouch on her belt and seated it with a quiet, solid click. The sound was a stark contrast to the rising panic around her. She wasn't preparing a weapon. She was greeting an old friend. While the Rangers were pinned down, their confidence bleeding out into the desert sand, Sergeant Morgan established her firing position. She didn't choose the obvious spot on the protected line. Instead, she moved 50 yards to the flank, using a small, natural depression in the terrain that offered a slightly different angle on the enemy ridge. Every movement was an exercise in efficiency, devoid of any wasted energy. She laid out a small, worn shooting mat, placed the rifle's bipod into the earth, and settled behind the weapon as if she were an extension of the stock itself. The chaos of the ambush, the panicked radio chatter, the whistle of incoming rounds, it all seemed to exist in a separate dimension. In her world, there was only the rifle, the wind, and the problem downrange. Thorne, catching her movement out of the corner of his eye, was about to scream at her to get down, to get out of the way. But the words died in his throat. He saw not a clerk, but a professional constructing her workspace with a terrifying level of focused intensity. He saw a posture he'd only seen in grainy training videos of legendary marksmen. He saw a calm that defied the very nature of the situation. He was paralyzed by a sudden, chilling premonition that he was a spectator in a theater he didn't understand. Morgan dialed her scope, her fingers dancing across the turrets with practiced familiarity. Her lips moved slightly, not in prayer, but in calculation. Windage, elevation, spin drift, barometric pressure. She wasn't guessing. She was solving a complex physics equation in seconds. Her left eye closed, and her right eye became one with the optic. The world dissolved into a magnified circle of crosshairs and heat shimmer. Then she breathed. A long, slow exhale emptying her lungs, steadying her body until her heartbeat was the only movement she could feel. In that silent pause between heartbeats, she pressed the trigger. The M210 bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and comforting recoil. The report of the rifle was sharp, distinct, a clean, authoritative statement. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, nearly 1,000 meters away on the ridge, a small puff of dust erupted from a crevice between two large boulders that the Rangers' frantic scans had completely missed. There was no visible enemy, just the result. The incoming fire from that position ceased instantly. A collective, involuntary gasp went through the pinned-down platoon. Before they could process what had happened, Morgan was already working the bolt action, the motion smooth and reflexive. She ejected the spent casing, chambered a new round, and shifted her aim slightly to the left. Again, the controlled breathing. Again, the silent calculation. Again, the clean break of the trigger. Crack! Another invisible threat, concealed in a tangle of desiccated brush, was neutralized. The suppressive fire that had been pinning down two Rangers vanished. 2 shots. 2 kills. Silence. Morgan broke her own silence, her voice cutting through the radio with startling clarity, devoid of any emotion. Grid 4-7-9, ER 289er. Hostile spotter, left of the prominent rock arch wind, is holding 1.5 mils from the west. She wasn't boasting. She was providing targeting data. She was integrating herself into their fight. Guided by her call, one of the Ranger snipers, his confidence now bolstered by her impossible display, found the target and fired. A third enemy position went quiet. She took out a fourth herself, a particularly difficult shot at a target moving between points of cover. The engagement was over in less than 90 seconds. 7 concealed, highly skilled enemy snipers had been systematically dismantled. 4 of them by a logistics sergeant with a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. The silence that descended upon Range 17 was no longer oppressive. It was deafening. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated awe and disbelief. The wind howled, as if trying to reclaim the authority that had just been so thoroughly stolen from it. The Rangers slowly rose from their cover, their eyes not on the distant ridge, but on the solitary, quiet figure of Sergeant Ava Morgan. Thorne stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of shattered arrogance. The world he knew, with its neat categories and rigid hierarchies, had just been burned to the ground. He managed to utter a single, choked phrase, a question directed at the universe itself. That's impossible. Who the hell are you? The dust cloud appeared on the horizon first, a tan plume growing rapidly as a pair of Humvees sped towards the firing line with urgent velocity. They skidded to a halt a few yards from the stun group, and from the lead vehicle stepped Colonel Davies. He moved with the unhurried purpose of a man whose authority was absolute and required no announcement. His face was a stern mask, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, betrayed a storm of thoughts. He had seen the entire ambush unfold on the drone feed, watching in real time as a routine exercise devolved into a lethal crisis, and then, just as quickly, was resolved by an impossible variable. He ignored the salutes of the shell-shocked Rangers. He walked right past the petrified staff Sergeant Thorne. His focus was singular, his path leading directly to the calm figure, now methodically cleaning her rifle as if she'd just finished a casual day of target practice. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze falling upon the M210 resting on its bipod. A flicker of recognition, of deep memory, crossed his face. He knew that rifle, or rather, the type of person who would wield such a weapon. It was not a standard-issue firearm. It was a legacy instrument, a tool of an artist, passed down and perfected over time. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight that cut through the wind. "Report." Morgan looked up, her expression as placid as ever. 7 hostile targets engaged and neutralized, sir. For by my hand, 3 by the Ranger element, acting on my spotting corrections. Range is secure. Her report was concise, technical, and utterly devoid of ego. It was the sterile language of an after-action report, not the breathless story of a hero. Colonel Davies nodded slowly, his eyes still on the rifle. Your name and unit, Sergeant. Sergeant Ava Morgan, 16th Logistics Battalion, attached for TAD audit. Sir, the answer was correct, official, and simultaneously a complete and utter lie of omission. The colonel held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Then he turned to his aide. Give me Sergeant Ava Morgan's service record. Full file. Authorization. Davies of 7 Alpha, the aide, a young captain, fumbled for his radio, startled by the gravity of the code. It was a high-level clearance, reserved for accessing the military's deepest, most sensitive secrets. The radio crackled, the secure signal connecting to the central command database. A voice, tinny and distant, responded after a tense pause, the data analyst on the other end clearly taken aback by what he was seeing on his screen. Sir, I have the file. It's heavily redacted. Read me what you can, Captain, Davies commanded, his voice never rising, but its intensity silencing the entire range. The captain began to read, his voice growing more incredulous with every word, broadcasting the truth to the assembled Rangers and the humiliated Staff Sergeant Thorne. The captain's voice, amplified by the radio handset, became the narrator of a legend none of them knew existed. Name, Morgan, Ava C. Rank, Sergeant. Sir, there's a flag here. Rank is provisional for current assignment. True rank is the voice paused, hesitant. Continue, Captain, Davies ordered, his eyes locked on Thorne, forcing him to bear witness. True rank is Master Sergeant. Sir, a wave of shock rippled through the Rangers. A Master Sergeant, a senior NCO of immense experience, was wearing a junior NCO stripes. It was a deliberate act of camouflage. Primary military occupational specialty. 92A, automated logistical specialist. The captain read the line, then hesitated again. Sir, that's her cover MOS. Her primary is listed as 18Z, Special Forces Senior Sergeant. It's followed by a string of special qualification identifiers I don't recognize. Thorne's face went pale. An 18Z, a Green Beret. A senior operator from the most elite echelons of the special operations community. The captain continued, his voice now filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. Unit of assignment, classified, detached from, redacted. Previous assignments include multiple tours with Joint Special Operations Command Task Forces. The names of conflict zones were read out. Not the ones from the news, but the quiet, brutal, unnamed battlefields where shadow wars were fought and won. The list of her qualifications was a litany of impossible achievements. Graduate, United States Army Sniper School, Fort Benning. Recipient of the Carlos Hathcock Award for Top Shot, Thorne felt his knees weaken. The Hathcock Award wasn't just for the best shooter in a class. It was a legendary honor given to a generational talent, a shooter whose skills bordered on the supernatural. Graduate, Special Forces Advanced Urban Combat Course. Graduate, High-Angle Marksmanship School. Qualifications, Distinguished Master Marksman, Rifle and Pistol. Combat hours, over 3,000. Sir, the final entry the captain read was the one that broke Thorne completely. Commendations include Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device for valor, multiple Purple Hearts, and a Distinguished Service Cross. Sir, the citation for the DSC is classified top secret, but the summary reads, for actions involving the elimination of a high-value target at extreme range under impossible conditions, saving the lives of an entire ODA team. The radio went silent. The captain had nothing more he was allowed to say. The truth settled over the desert range, heavier and more powerful than the midday heat. This wasn't a clerk. This wasn't even just a soldier. This was a living legend, a quiet professional of the highest possible caliber, hiding in plain sight. Colonel Davies took a slow, deliberate step forward. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture ramrod straight. In a gesture that stunned every man present, the full-bird colonel, the commander of the entire installation, rendered a slow, sharp, and perfect salute to the junior-ranked sergeant. It was a profound inversion of military protocol, an act of ultimate respect that transcended rank and spoke only of demonstrated worth. Master Sergeant Morgan, Davies said, his voice booming with an authority that was now laced with deep reverence. On behalf of the United States Army, thank you. You just saved the lives of every man on this range. He then slowly lowered his salute and turned, his eyes finding Thorne like a weapon system locking onto a target. Staff Sergeant Thorne, he began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. Your assumptions today were a disgrace to your rank and your regiment. You saw a uniform, not the soldier wearing it. You saw gender, not the professional behind the rifle. You were so busy puffing up your own ego that you failed to recognize true competence when it was standing right in front of you, auditing your damn ammunition. Let this be the most important lesson you ever learn. Respect is not earned by the patch on your shoulder. It is earned by the skill in your hands and the character in your heart. Today, you met a real ranger. Take notes. The story of what happened on Range 17 spread not like wildfire, but like the shockwave from a detonation. It moved silently and invisibly at first, through secure channels and hushed conversations between senior NCOs, before erupting into the open. Within a day, every soldier on the base knew. They knew that a logistics sergeant had single-handedly broken a sophisticated sniper ambush. Within a week, the legend had a name. The ghost of Range 17. The details began to shift and warp as they were retold in barracks and chow halls, growing more mythic with each telling. The 7 enemy snipers became a dozen. The M210 became a magical rifle capable of impossible feats. But the core of the story, the incredible, humbling truth of it, remained intact. Sergeant Ava Morgan, the quiet clerk, became a symbol. She was the living embodiment of the quiet professional, a cautionary tale against the sin of arrogance. She became a ghost story told to cocky new recruits to remind them that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice the least. Colonel Davies made sure the lesson was not lost. Staff Sergeant Thorne was formally reprimanded, a black mark on his otherwise stellar record. But Davies knew that public disgrace was a far more potent and lasting punishment than any administrative action. He didn't want Thorne broken. He wanted him remade. And Thorne was. The event had not just shattered his arrogance. It had fundamentally rewired his worldview. The certainty he had lived with, the simple binary of Ranger and POG, was gone, replaced by a humbling and complex understanding of human potential. A few weeks after the incident, he found Sergeant Morgan. She was still, officially, Sergeant Morgan, inspecting inventory in a cavernous supply warehouse. He approached her not with a swagger, but with the hesitant deference of a student approaching a master. He didn't offer a clumsy, fumbling apology. He knew words were insufficient. Instead, he made a request. "Ma'am," he said, the word ma'am, now holding the weight of genuine respect he had previously feigned. "I was wrong. My men and I, we have a lot to learn. Not just about shooting, about seeing. Would you be willing to teach us?" Morgan looked up from her data pad, her expression as neutral as ever. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze analytical, assessing his sincerity. She saw not the arrogant instructor from the range, but a humbled man genuinely seeking to better himself and his soldiers. She gave a single, curt nod. "Range 17, 0500, Friday," she said, before returning to her work. The lessons were unlike anything the Rangers had ever experienced. She didn't teach them advanced marksmanship. They were already experts in the mechanics of shooting. She taught them what came before. She taught them patience, observation, and the discipline of silence. She had them lie in the desert for hours, armed not with rifles, but with notebooks, and tasked them with sketching every detail of a small patch of terrain until they knew every rock and every shadow. She taught them to read the wind not as an obstacle, but as a source of information. She taught them to control their breathing, their heart rate, their own internal monologue of doubt and fear. Her instruction was minimalist, her praise rare, and her criticism precise. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her silent, undeniable competence was more motivational than any shouted platitude. The transformation in Thorne's platoon was remarkable. They became quieter, more observant, more methodical. Their movements in the field were more fluid, their communication more precise. They started seeing the world not as a collection of targets, but as a complex tapestry of information to be patiently unraveled. The arrogance that had been their trademark was replaced by a quiet, collective confidence, a confidence born not of a patch on their shoulder, but of proven, tested skill. Thorne himself became a different kind of leader. He was still demanding, still pushed his men to their absolute limits, but his motivations had changed. He was no longer trying to build swaggering warriors. He was trying to forge quiet professionals. He became a fierce advocate against prejudice of any kind, often telling the story of his own humiliation as a cautionary tale for new NCOs. The legend of Range 17 became institutionalized. A small, simple plaque was mounted in the platoon's ready room. It wasn't flashy. It was a piece of polished brass, and mounted in its center was a single, gleaming 762mm casing, the very first one ejected from Morgan's M210 during the ambush. Thorne had recovered it from the desert himself. Beneath the casing, a simple inscription was engraved, words that had become the platoon's unofficial motto, a constant reminder of a lesson they had learned in blood and humility. It read, "Assumptions are heavier than AMMO. SGT. Morgan, Range 17-inch Sergeant Morgan, or Master Sergeant Morgan, was never seen on the main base again after her audit was complete. She simply disappeared back into the classified world from which she had briefly emerged. There was no awards ceremony, no public commendation. Her actions, like the rest of her career, were destined to live in the shadows, known only to a select few. But her impact remained. She had become a part of the regiment's folklore, a new verse in the long song of its history. New Rangers would hear the story and look at the quiet support personnel on the base, the cooks, the mechanics, the clerks, with a newfound sense of respect, wondering if one of them might also be a ghost, a hidden legend walking among them. She had left behind more than just a story. She had changed the culture. She had taught them that the most lethal weapon on any battlefield is a calm mind, and that the greatest strength is the discipline to prove your worth through action, not words. The Rangers of Thorne's platoon carried that lesson with them on every subsequent deployment. They became known for their preternatural situational awareness, their ability to spot threats no one else could see. They survived missions that others would not have, not because they were better shots, but because Sergeant Morgan had taught them how to truly see the world around them. Her legacy was not a medal or a plaque, but the lives of the men she had saved both on that day and in the years that followed. A year later, deep in a dusty, forgotten valley on the other side of the world, Master Sergeant Thorne, his promotion had finally come through, lay beside his sniper team on a windswept ridge. They had been watching a high-value target's compound for 2 days, a grueling test of patience and endurance. The mission was critical, the intelligence hazy. Everything depended on their ability to remain undetected. A young sergeant next to him, a new addition to the team who had only heard the stories of Range 17, grew restless. "Master Sergeant," he whispered, "I've got nothing." The intel was bad. "This place is a ghost town." Thorne didn't respond immediately. He just lay there, perfectly still, his breathing slow and even. He was scanning the compound, but he wasn't just looking at the buildings. He was watching the heat haze dance off a metal roof. He was observing the way a tattered flag fluttered in the inconsistent breeze. He was listening to the silence. It was a lesson Morgan had drilled into them. Silence is never empty. It is full of information. Then he saw it. A single, misplaced detail. On the roof of the main building, a small flock of pigeons was roosting. But every few minutes, for no discernible reason, they would all startle and fly up in a panicked circle before settling down again. There was no predator, no loud noise. It was unnatural. He remembered Morgan's words from one of their desert lessons. Nature has a rhythm. Look for the thing that breaks the rhythm. The pigeons were breaking the rhythm. Thorne keyed his microphone, his voice a low whisper. "Command, this is Reaper 1. I think we have a concealed ventilation shaft on the main roof. The target is likely in a subterranean bunker beneath the structure. The inconsistent airflow is spooking the local wildlife." It was a theory based on a ghost of a clue, an assumption so subtle most would have dismissed it. But Thorne's team had been trained to trust these subtle signs. Based on his observation, the operational plan was changed from a direct assault to a precision airstrike. The resulting strike was a success, eliminating the target and his entire command structure with 0 friendly casualties. The post-strike assessment confirmed it. A massive, state-of-the-art bunker complex had been hidden directly beneath the compound, its ventilation system cleverly disguised. Master Sergeant Thorne had saved his team and ensured mission success not with his rifle, but with a lesson learned from a quiet logistics clerk a year earlier. His official report simply stated that the target was identified through sustained, patient observation, but he knew the truth. It was Morgan's legacy at work. The folklore of her actions had become doctrine. The story of the ghost of Range 17 was now a mandatory part of the indoctrination for every new NCO at their home base. Colonel Davies himself would often tell it, using it to dismantle the egos of young, arrogant leaders. The M210 rifle, her legacy weapon, was eventually put on display in a glass case at the Special Operations Command headquarters, its simple wooden stock a stark contrast to the high-tech weaponry surrounding it. The plaque beneath it didn't list battles or kill counts. It just read, "Competence is a language of ITS own. True strength is not loud. It does not announce its presence or demand respect. It simply is. It is the quiet professional who speaks through decisive, precise action. It is the calm heart in the midst of chaos. It is the wisdom to know that assumptions are the enemy of truth, and that prejudice is a self-inflicted blindness that prevents one from seeing the reality of the person standing right in front of them. The world is full of noise, of people clamoring for attention, broadcasting their perceived importance. But true worth, the kind that saves lives and changes cultures, is forged in silence and demonstrated in moments of extreme pressure. It is the legacy of Sergeant Ava Morgan, a legacy defined not by the rank on her collar, but by the unwavering professionalism in her soul. She reminded an entire generation of warriors that the content of one's character and the depth of one's skill are the only metrics that truly matter. Her story became a powerful current in the river of military history, a quiet but irresistible force that wore down the jagged rocks of arrogance and carved a new path of humility and respect. The lesson was simple, yet profound. You do not have to be the loudest voice in the room to be the most powerful. You just have to be the most competent. That is a truth that echoes long after the gunfire has faded. A true legacy isn't what you leave behind in a record book or a display case. It is the standard of excellence that continues forward in the actions and beliefs of those you inspired. It is the young ranger who learns to see beyond the uniform. It is the humbled leader who learns to value substance over style. It is the quiet understanding that the ultimate validation comes not from the praise of others, but from the silent, internal knowledge that when the moment came, you were ready. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where silent precision defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.